We will talk about diversity of contexts, experiences, approaches. We will talk about cross-cultural communications, what's worth considering in communicating to representatives of different cultures, how to communicate more effectively in today's modern world. And in this context, it is symbolic for me to pass on a reliable partner, international partner. It's an International Institute of Mediation, which builds global ecosystem of quality mediation. They further high standards. They support mediators. And of course, they also support cross-cultural understanding between the nations. Colleagues, I thank you for everything you do to develop mediation worldwide. Thank you for being today with us and sharing experiences. I'd like to give the floor to Ivana Ninčić, who's the international director of the Institute.
Thank you, Luisa, for this lovely introduction, and welcome everyone joining us from far and wide. My name is Ivana Ninčić, and I have the honor of being IMI's executive director and to welcome you to today's session. As Luisa mentioned, IMI is a Hague-based nonprofit public interest initiative, which was established to drive transparency and high competency standards into mediation practice worldwide. We have the honor and are very grateful to be supporting this forum for the last 3 years and to have the Ukrainian Academy of Mediators as our valued partner and also implementing organization, so recognized training provider in Ukraine. So IMI was established to provide global leadership in the field of dispute prevention and early effective dispute resolution by creating an internationally applicable structure and standards of high quality mediation, and by setting several objectives, including establishing an international mediator and mediation advocate credentialing scheme, as well as taking on leadership in various policy roles, and the Intercultural Competency Task Force and the criteria was one of the first areas that IMI identified as extremely important to raise awareness of this important area and also raise the standards. So with us today, we have IMI's chair, Tat Lim, a global elite thought leader based in Singapore, and also IMI certified mediator and mediation advocate. We have also 2 members of the Intercultural Competency Task Force, Hannah Tümpel, who is a mediator, lawyer, and trainer based in Germany. And she has previously held leading positions in the ICC and UNESCO and World Colleges, United World Colleges. And last but not least, we have with us Jeremy Lack, also an IMI certified mediator and mediation advocate, member of IMI's International Advisory Committee and the Intercultural Competency Committee, and he is based from Switzerland. So I hope you enjoy today's session, and I hereby hand over the floor to Hannah.
Thank you so much, Ivana. Welcome, everyone. I can say on behalf of Jeremy and Tat, I think that we are absolutely delighted to be here and to kick off this year's forum. And it was really touching to see everybody join in the chat. It seems like we really have the world represented here. I didn't catch everybody, but from Nigeria to India, from Singapore to Ukraine to Switzerland, there is a great variety in this room, and this is wonderful. I will have the honor of moderating the next 75 minutes, as well as being a panelist. And I will tell you more about my co-panelists, or they will introduce themselves in just a moment. But before that, I will give you a brief overview of what we would like to do in the next 75 minutes. So as Ivana mentioned, there was an IMI task force working on the intercultural competencies quite some time ago. And we would like to provide you with a summary of the history and background and content of the IMI intercultural mediation competencies. We will then focus in on the so-called cultural focus areas, and you will understand in a bit what we actually refer to. Together with you, we would like to consider with you how and whether they should be further developed and maybe modified. And in the last part of the panel, the three of us would like to share some personal experience, how in our mediation practice, we have come to use these specific criteria for our preparation and in the mediations themselves. All of this is not just going to be us talking to you, but we are very keen to hear from you. There will be different moments when we will invite your questions. You can put them in the chat, or if you want to later on, you can raise your hand and we would love to hear from you. There will also be some participative elements through Mentimeters, which many of you will surely know, where we can make collective word clouds and get a bit of feel of what everybody is thinking in this huge room of now almost 600 participants. And we will in fact kick off with one of these Mentimeters. And this is based on a question the organizers asked us to ask you, and we love to pick it up because it will demonstrate a bit more the diversity of this room. And with that, I will start sharing my screen. And I hope everybody now sees my screen. And we will kick off with the first question, because we would like to know from which country are you from, or maybe also from which country are you joining right now. So if you have a mobile, please use the QR code. If for some reason that doesn't work for you, you can also go to menti.com and use the code as you see it on the slide. The code is 11015115. And I believe somebody will also put it in the chat, so you can just follow the link there. Please put into the Mentimeter where you're from. If you can't read Ukrainian, I believe in the section on the answers, it just says that you put your country there. So maybe it's 1 or maybe it's 2. We will give you just a few moments, and Luisa will then share the results as she sees the word cloud growing. Luisa, I will stop sharing here, so maybe you can share your screen. Luisa, I can't hear you.
Я вмикаю демонстрацію.
Ah, there. Great.
I'm turning my screen on already. Just give me a second.
Ah, there we go. Wonderful, and it's still growing. I see Australia, Switzerland, Israel, Lithuania, Kuwait, Armenia, Singapore, Croatia, the US, Hungary. Wonderful. The UK, Germany, North Macedonia. The very active word cloud keeps moving. Greece. Wonderful. Do keep adding to that, because the organizers are very keen to see how global this event has become and to see from where you are joining. Okay, thank you very much. And with that, we will dive right into today's topic, which is culture. And before we talk about it, we thought we wanted to get a sense of what culture is for you. And accordingly, we will ask you to go a second time to the Mentimeter and to tell us the elements which constitute culture for you. So please type into the Mentimeter, the next one, which you see on this slide, 3 elements which constitute culture for you. And again, if the QR code doesn't work, you can go directly to the page and type in the code, which this time is 26196558. I will give it a few moments for the word cloud to grow. And then I will ask the organizers again to please show us the results where we might need translation, because maybe we will find some Ukrainian words. Yeah, actually quite some. Okay, so I will read the ones I can read, and then maybe somebody can tell us a few of the Ukrainian ones. So I can see language, history, people, values, traditions, cuisine, diversity, environment. Values is getting bigger. Language is very big. And Luisa, can you maybe read some of the bigger Ukrainian words to us?
Так, я прочитаю зараз. Це мова, традиції, виховання, історія,
Language, traditions, morale, religion, ethnicity. These are quite large. People, environment, tolerance, knowledge, territory, respect, care, family.
Wonderful. I also see food and music.
І ще освіта.
Beliefs is one which I also see. Wonderful. Again, it's a word cloud which keeps growing. So thank you for that. I think Jeremy and Tat are already studying it with great interest and might comment on it in a moment. But before we do that, let us give you the one definition of culture which we would like to work with today, which is very meta level and very general. It's from Gerd Hofstede, and he said culture is the collective programming of the mind, which distinguishes the members of one group or category of people from another. And what we find important to say at the beginning of the session is that culture, in our understanding, is very much something which we share with others, and it is different to what personality is, because that's something very individual. So of course we all differ, but we also, within the context within which we live, we share certain things with others. And from this definition, what we follow is that we all have many cultures, and 3 ones we certainly have, usually. It's our family culture, so family of origin, or maybe new family. Secondly, our learning environment culture, so where did we learn, where did we study? And thirdly, our workplace culture, our professional culture, where do we work? And based on this understanding of culture, I would like now to ask my 2 panelists to introduce themselves, because that will give you a bit more information about that, in addition to what Ivana said before. So if they had to present themselves with regard to these 3 elements of culture, what would it be? Tat, would you like to kick off?
All right. Well, first of all, hello everyone. It's good to be here. It's almost 8:50 here in Singapore, so getting a bit dark. But you know, in this part of the world where I live, and especially some of my Singaporean friends are here as well, family culture would mean, I think, different things to the different, constituents of a Singaporean. And in the space that I belong, I think one would say that my culture, family culture, is defined and formed largely by the ancestors of mine who 2 generations ago emigrated from China to Singapore. So what family culture would look like for me is some very dominant themes which would pervade across certain parts of the year. For example, eating together, food, I like the idea of food being one of the Mentimeters word. Food is very important, not just for a Singaporean, but also in the ethnic culture that I belong to, the family culture, particularly during, for example, the Lunar or Chinese New Year. And one cultural habit that we have in the family is that during Chinese New Year, especially the night before Chinese New Year, we get together for what we call a reunion meal. And that habit is not formed by us living in Singapore, but we adopted it based on the traditions that my ancestors have developed way back when they were living in China. So I think that's a very dominant family culture that I have. I'm not sure whether, I should just hand the floor over, because I think professional culture and learning environment culture are also somewhat different, but I should maybe stop there and hand this back to you, Hannah. Perhaps Jeremy will have a lot more to share in terms of that space.
Thank you so much, Ted. And yes, over to you, Jeremy. Family, learning environment, professional.
Yes.
What are your three cultures?
And first of all, just a quick word to everybody. Thank them for having invited me to join the panel today, and that I hope that everybody is safe and that we can hope for more peaceful times in the difficult period that everybody is living through. So I think everybody's on our thoughts, and we understand the difficulties in current geopolitics. Coming back to today's session, though, and my family culture and the patterns of behavior. I grew up with around 8 different family cultures because, first of all, my grandparents were Ashkenazi Jews from Poland, from Russia, from Ukraine. And they then immigrated on one side of my family to the UK, and then on the other side of my family to Israel. And so my parents were born in Israel and in the United Kingdom, which is a very different set of cultures. But I was born in Switzerland. My wife, I met her in the United States, and our children are American, but also Italian, because my wife's family are all extremely Italian from Sicily. So when it comes to food and meals and the kind of things that we want to sit around celebrating national holidays, religious holidays, Thanksgiving, happy, New Year's with different dates, it can get very confusing. And so we have to be adapting our family culture even for when we are sitting together as a family. When it comes to the learning environment, so I grew up in Switzerland, but I had the privilege of going to an international school where I had children that spoke around, more than 80 mother tongues and more than 120 nationalities. So being in my class every 2-3 years, students would change. It was part of the United Nations environment. And so I realized very early on that there wasn't any one culture in the school that I was at. If anything, the norm was multicultural. And then when I went on to university, I had my first culture shock because I went to England and, it was at a very formal university. We had to wear robes to have dinner. We had eating requirements. We had to say grace in Latin, wearing our gowns before formal meals. That was a very different approach. But even studying, I did 2 degrees, one in law and one in physiological sciences. Law was very library based. You had to sit and you had to kind of sit quietly and teach yourself. Whereas with the physiological sciences, you're in labs doing very different sorts of work with other students and encountering all sorts of obstacles in the laboratory that you had to share and other students had to help you out with. So that was a very different learning environment as well, depending on the subjects that I studied. And then finally, in the professional workplace culture, I started off practicing as a barrister in London. These barristers wear, horsehair wigs and gowns as well, still very formal and very English. And then I went to work in America with a large patent litigation firm that did a lot of jury patent litigation trials. Very different culture there as well. 170 litigators all under the same roof, all doing nothing but patent litigation day in, day out. And then from there, I moved in-house to a medical device company, a very large multinational with over 50,000 employees. That's, again, a very different culture. And then I moved on to working with startups. And still today, depending on my clients and the environment I work with, I need to adapt my behavior to the people I'm working with case by case. So I think those are examples of how different cultures can come to the forefront and affect and shape both our backgrounds, but also how we need to adapt to any situation.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And I will add to the trio by saying that my family culture is a very Protestant, very West German culture, whatever that might mean to you. My learning environment was extremely international and cross-cultural. And my workplace environment is that of a lawyer as well, and that of a German lawyer. And hence punctuality is one of the things I will take great pride in. And I will accordingly take up my role as moderator a bit tougher now and remind everybody to really stick to time. With that, we will go on and start talking about the IMI criteria. We would like to introduce them to you and to bring them again to everybody's mind. And I will firstly hand over to Tat, who will give us in maximum 5 minutes a quick summary of the history and background and the reasons why IMI developed these criteria. Over to you, Tat.
Right, wonderful. And I'm going to run along with these couple of ideas. First of all, I mean, as a short introduction, there are these 3 areas of IMI intercultural competences that you will find when you visit the IMI's website. And I certainly invite everyone after this session to hop onto the IMI website just to have a look at these 3 different areas of competences. I just want to touch on lightly what the general requirements are at IMI for certifying institutions. Later on, you will find Jeremy expanding on what the substantive criteria is for the training. And of course, Hannah will also touch on the CFAs, the cultural focus areas. Insofar as the IMI's history, and maybe we can move to the next slide, you will see that the work of the IMI in this area started a long time ago. This task force was set up in 2010 by 2 very accomplished mediation practitioners and writers, one of which is, of course, Hal Abramson, and the other is Joanna Kalowski, familiar names to a lot of us in this space, right? And you will see that there was consultation taken in 3 different places, Paris, Brisbane, and Singapore. And what has been a joy is that while preparing for this presentation, I had the opportunity to go back and look at some of the photographs. And, you know, some of my colleagues who were there with me during this consultation, we looked so much younger then. But, you know, this is really some time ago. So as you can see, the goal of this task force is to help and identify and apply theories about culture so that mediators can consider appropriate issues and design the process when setting up and facilitating intercultural mediations. Maybe we can move on to the next slide where we can talk about some of these specific requirements for the general requirements when that ICQAP, an intercultural qualifying assessment program, must meet in order to be able to qualify mediators for the IMI intercultural competence. You will see that under the general requirements column, there are essentially 4 things, 4 criteria that the ICQAP must meet. The first is methodology. The ICQAP must implement a performance-based assessment methodology for assessing whether a candidate's performance meets each of the substantive criteria, which later on my other speakers will speak about. The second criteria you can see is transparency, which means the benchmark and criteria applied by an ICQAP must also be published and openly accessible on the organization's website. The third is the integrity issue, which means that every assessor must have substantial experience of evaluating the performance of mediators and in working in intercultural situations. And then the last criteria is diversity, which means that the ICQAP must be accessible on an equal basis to experienced mediators, regardless of the mediator's professional affiliation, gender, race, ethnicity, age, religion, sexual orientation, or other personal characterization. That's all I think I need to say at this point in time. Certainly, I think there's a lot more to this that you can find out when you visit the IMI's website. Next slide, please. This is a quote by one of the task force leaders, and I think it's probably salient to just state what she has said in full. She says that this entire framework is designed to ensure mediators working across cultures have the requisite knowledge, skills, sensitivities, and approaches. The criteria are offered as a basis for the development of cross and intercultural mediators training programs. These criteria do not recommend any particular mediation model, and it's still less so that one model is more cultural or interculturally viable. The question for mediation practitioners and for mediators active in different culture is whether the models differ and have the cultural factors been taken into account in their design and implementation. Next slide, please. And so you will find later on when Jeremy speaks, as well as Hannah, when they talk about the cultural focus areas, one of the things that the task force have been very careful to say is that the task force doesn't regard the list of CFAs as comprehensive. They've actually encouraged the ICQAPs to consider these CFAs, but to adapt them and develop other cultural focus areas based on theories of culture or method of mediation. So that, I think, is all that would be helpful to introduce at this point. And I would like to hand this over now to Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Tat. So I think what I'll just do is give you a very brief overview of the substantive criteria that that were designed and that they came up with the task force. And basically, you can break it down into two categories. One of them is knowledge-based, and the other one is skills-based. And then within each of them, it's sub-broken into three. So if we can move on to the next slide, I'll try and just explain the knowledge-based ones first. So in the knowledge-based criteria, what we expect any course or any standardized system is to be able to help people understand the concept of a cultural framework. So there are several cultural frameworks that exist: Hofstadter, Trumpenauer's, Hall, Edward. There are many different approaches. If you just take Hofstadter's, which is one of the very well-known ones, this is a person who's gone around the world and identified groups of people by country, according to 6 dimensions, the acceptance of a distance from power, individualist versus collectivist behavior, attitudes towards success and achievement. Is it a nurturing, or is it kind of a competitive environment? Uncertainty avoidance, how tolerant are people of uncertainty, or how much do they need, as I am in Switzerland, to have a lot of certainty and clarity around me? Long-term versus short-term orientation, and then a recent new dimension was indulgence, or self-gratification to some extent, to what extent that's allowed or frowned upon. So those are dimensions you can look at that help you kind of think about culture, trying to use a different norm. The big danger is stereotyping, and I think what the system requires is, try to avoid stereotyping. You can't think, all the French are like this, all the Germans are like this, all the Swiss are like this, but they do create working hypotheses using these dimensions to help think about that can influence process design. And one of the most interesting things I think that the task force came up with is a topic that Hannah will address, which is the CFAs, the cultural focus areas, because we were looking at conflict in particular and trying to think what areas affect a conflict and the design of a process. And that's where we realized there were different cultural approaches that you can, again, look at according to the 6 dimensions. So if you're from an individualist culture or a collectivist culture, for example, do you caucus more or do you do more in joint session? These are some of the things that can have a direct or indirect link, but in any event, it's to understand these cultural frameworks and to be able to apply the theory to practice. That's what it was about. The second category, then, it was self-awareness. Obviously, you can come to the room thinking about others, but what about yourself? What biases do we bring into the room? And what happens when we have a mix of cultures? As you saw from the presentation earlier today, we actually have a mix of cultures inside each of us, depending on our family, kind of patterns that we learned, on the educational patterns that we learned, or the workplace patterns that we learned. But when you get people in a different room, and different people in the same room, and you expect them to work together, you can expect that there's at least maybe even 9 cultures in the room if there's 3 people. And so what you sometimes need to do is create a common culture for the group. How are we going to work together? How direct can we be with one another? How do we use first names? To what extent will we have an informal or informal approach? And what we do needs to have a framework, a knowledge framework behind it, to help us think through and drive it. Let's call it theoretically at first, and then we move on to the next slide. We get more into some of the skill sets that this touches upon. So the skill sets are obviously communication. We need to be able to adjust the style, tone, and quality of the communication to the people in the room. I'm not talking about only kind of language questions about how well people understand or speak the same language, but it's even to what extent emotions are accepted and nonverbal communication. A mediation, as you all know, over the telephone is very different from mediation over the video, which is, again, different from having people in a room. And if people are sharing food in a mediation around a table, that makes, again, a very different basis for discussion, triggering different forms of behavior. In fact, I work a lot with neuroscience, and we've done some studies that show very clearly that there's a flexibility for a sense of feeling in group or out of group that will increase or reduce your ability to be in empathy or compassion with other people in the room, depending on whether or not you feel in group or out of group with them. And that's where I think a mediator can very much influence how people feel coming into the room, and creating that notion of we, one group working together, as opposed to us versus them, two sides of a table having to negotiate things. And a lot of things have been done. And this comes into preparation questions that are not only linguistic, interpretation, what's going to be there, but even basic exercises. So, for example, it's a famous example was done for the Palestinian and Israel peace talks, showing pictures of grandchildren. Yasser Arafat and Rabin, I believe it was, shared pictures of their grandchildren to have a discussion about the future they wanted, and that made a very big difference to the quality of their conversation at one stage. So we're looking here at all the things that up front can help to kind of redefine this and to design a process that takes into account the different preferences that people will have. And maybe later on, as we get to it, Hannah, we can talk about how some of these different things have come up in real life and how each of us had to deal with them when we've had people coming from different cultures into the room with expectations that their cultures would be the dominant culture in how we would move forward, but we had to kind of invent and generate a new third or fourth culture even to be more inclusive of everybody and find a way forward. So I think this kind of summarizes both in terms of communications, preparations, and how to manage the process once it started, to align expectations, procedural, and even the ability to have emotions, which in the UK, for example, you would go straight to a caucus if somebody shows a sign of emotion, because emotion is not a comfortable thing for British, stiff upper lip and so on, but would be very acceptable in other cultures. And on the contrary, you would keep them together so they can have a pro-social bonding experience, as opposed to separating things. So these are all examples of what we need to understand and think about before we get into the room. And that's where I think the task force did a wonderful job. But again, I'm part of it, so I'm not very objective about it, and we'd love to get your feedback on that later on. Hannah, I think we should move over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Jeremy. Before we move to the cultural focus areas, I would like to make space for one or two questions. Are there any comments or questions at this point? You are welcome to put them into the chat or to raise your Zoom hand, and then the organizers will enable you to speak. Any questions or comments? Jeremy and Tat, you need to tell me if something comes up in the chat, but I think...
No, I think it's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Then we might have some later on. Okay, so we will continue now to the cultural focus areas, which Jeremy already mentioned. Ole, I see we have one question. So let me go back and take that one. Could somebody allow Ole to unmute? please. Now.
Oh, super. Hello, Hannah. Hello, everyone. And I would like to thank you for this information you have given now, because it really reminds me this value of understanding the peculiarities of different cultures, which I observed myself when I was studying in IMI certified program. It's National Mediation Campus or Consensus. And knowing these cultural aspects and seeing them when in your group there are people from 20 countries, different countries, and understanding how it works and observing it at the same time is absolutely valuable. And I'm making notes now, and really I would like to thank Jeremy for this phrase about all the feeling people in group or out of group, and how much it influences the ability and the wish to collaborate. So thank you very much for this. I made a note.
Great. Thank you so much, Ole, for this comment. And I think it's very true that for many of us, even the mediation training itself is already an intercultural experience, right? Which is wonderful about many of the international programs. Or even if it is only with people from our own country, there will be many different cultures as well, depending on professional backgrounds and so on. Perfect. Thank you very much, Ole. We'll have other moments for questions also a bit later on. I would like to move on now to the cultural focus areas, which were shortly introduced already. It is the third element of which the task force, the IMI task force, developed. And more specifically, they are categories which we believe are useful for mediators to keep in mind when working interculturally. We think these are categories which help you in preparing for mediation, which help you when interacting with the participants in the mediation, when bridging differences, and when trying to establish common ground. So our main work as mediators. What is important to note at the very beginning is that this list was never meant to be exhaustive. It was at the time the list of 6 categories, which we found were the most relevant. But we always intended this list to grow and to change with time, and that there might be other areas you would like to focus on or you do focus on in your mediation practice. And we will actually collect your feedback on that in just a moment. And we ourselves found it quite interesting to look at this list after many years now, and think how already our thinking about cultural focus areas has changed, and how we would maybe do certain things differently today. Let me quickly take you through the 6 elements of the cultural focus areas. The first is what we call the relatedness and communication styles. So we think it's important to consider as you prepare for mediation or as you're in a mediation, how do the parties, how do you communicate? Is it direct or indirect? How about emotions? Are they high or are they low? How do you express emotions? Is there a lot of expressiveness or are they rather held back? Is there a lot of verbal or non-verbal communication? The other day I taught an LLM course to an international class here in Berlin, and we talked about what it means culturally to us when you look into somebody's eyes as you listen to them. And one student said, well, of course it means that I listen really well, because if somebody doesn't look into my eyes, that means they are not listening, they are not interested. So of course I want the other person to look into my eyes. And then a Kenyan student said, no, that would be considered extremely unrespectful in my culture. You would never look somebody into the eyes, especially not an elder person. That would be a sign of disrespect. Great surprise in the class, how something as easy and simple as looking into the other eyes can be decoded very differently depending on cultural background. The second category is mindset towards conflict. What does conflict mean to the people in your mediation? Is it something positive to have a conflict, or is it something negative? Are they ready to take high risks, or they would rather like to avoid risks? Is conflict or repairing of conflict something about managing tasks, or is it about the relationship behind it? Second category to consider. The third category we think is important is the party's mindset, and also your own mindset, towards the mediation process. What are the expectations in the room? What do the parties want the mediator to do? What do they want each other to do? Do they need an agenda? Do they need any social protocols? Do they want very identifiable phases during the mediation, which you can orderly define, as we are now in the first phase and now in the second? Or do they want something much more fluid? The mediation process. The fourth category is the orientation towards exchanging information. Is it a culture where people share information very openly? Is it very transparent, or is it rather non-transparent? Is it about sharing a lot of information, or rather about narrowing it down to the relevant facts or the assumed relevant facts? Is it very fact-related, or is it non-fact related? Something which will also greatly shape your mediation process. The fifth category we came up with was time orientation. How important are deadlines to the parties, both with regard to the outcome, but also with regard to the mediation process? What about punctuality? Do they agree on that? How do you manage that? What's with regard to the duration of the mediation itself, the frequency of meetings, the duration and frequency of caucuses, so of sessions just with one party? What is the expectations with regard to the timeline by which they want to reach an outcome? And sixthly, final and last category, decision-making approaches. Is it a culture where it's easy and acceptable to compromise, or is it rather a non-compromising culture? Is there structure needed, or is it rather an unstructured approach? Is it a culture where the participants themselves, or where the solution and the mediation is very participant-driven or very constituency-driven, so the groups and communities behind them? Is it about general or very specific forms of agreement? Which form does the agreement need to take? Is it an individualist culture, a majority-led, or a collectivist culture? So how do you actually reach outcomes? How do you come to decisions? So these are the 6 categories, the cultural focus areas we came up. We would love to hear from you now what you think is missing here. And before we open again for questions, I think it would be good to open the floor to everyone. And so I will take you to our next and final Mentimeter. And the question is, which elements are missing from the cultural focus areas for you? And on the slides, you see again the 6 different ones which we came up with. Please use the QR code again, or alternatively go to menti.com and use the code 18645171. Which elements are missing from the cultural focus areas for you? I'll give you a few moments to complete this, and then I will ask Luisa to start sharing her screen again.
Так, я готова демонструвати, але більш
Yeah, I'm actually
повільно
ready to share,
відбувається
but it
робота.
seems that our audience is working a little bit slower right now. So they probably need more time to think about it.
Okay, that's perfect. I'm also still typing. Luisa, how are we doing?
Yeah, I can do.
Great. We can
Все
also
добре, вмикаю
see it.
демонстрацію.
Everything is great. I'm going to share my screen right now.
Okay, so I will pick out a few which I see, and then I will need a Ukrainian speaker again to help me. And I think we also have some additional ones in the chat. So uncertainty tolerance is one I see. Leadership style is one. And Tat and Jeremy, pay attention now because I'll ask you to comment on this. I see experience, neurodiversity, legal regulations, mediation process expectations, values, which food you eat, language barriers, spirituality, gender. Okay, and maybe I'll leave it there. Could somebody help me who speaks Ukrainian to read some of the big words in Ukrainian?
Я можу прочитати. Я
I
можу
can do
прочитати.
that.
Я бачу
I can see risks, customs, morality, religion, traditions,
довіра,
trust, respect.
Я ще бачила, зараз не бачу.
I saw some other things as well. War veterans, because there's different experience they have.
Рівень емоційного інтелекту,
Emotional intelligence,
критичне мислення,
critical thinking.
очікування щодо процесу,
Well, again, expectations for mediation process.
мислення щодо конфлікту, етнічна складова,
Mindset about the conflict, ethnicity,
досвід.
experience again. Well, there are so many other things, many different options, but I only read the biggest ones.
Great. Thank you very much. This is really helpful. Jeremy, do you want to pick too many, maybe of those just mentioned, which you would comment on?
Yes, I think, first of all, I think the notion of technology, which is a small word in here, but I couldn't pick it up for the others, is more and more important as we look forward. To what extent are people going to be comfortable in incorporating technology into mediations? We saw that already during COVID, people working online or offline. We now have a lot of new questions about artificial intelligence. To what extent are people going to be comfortable including or not including them in mediations? And we can talk a bit more about that later on if you'd like. So that was one that I was looking at. When I look at the words in Ukrainian that are written, you know, morality, language, religion, I think they are captured in part by some of the other existing cultural values. But I was taken up by the one that you mentioned, which is neurodiversity. I think that is an interesting new one, which relates maybe to gender, which relates to age also, not only in a sense of respect for the elderly, but also in terms of speed of working. You know, again, maybe that touches on some of the technology issues, the forum issues, doing it in person or not, sharing a meal or not. These are all important aspects. And maybe one thing that might be missing for me as I look at it, it's a notion of face that is partly in some of the cultural dimensions, but I think it's something we could maybe look at again differently. But all of this shows to me that there's a lot of input and new opportunities for us to go back, which I'm very excited about, because I do think the cultural focus areas are maybe some of the most important things that came out of the task force's work, in addition to setting good standards. So it's very encouraging to see so many ideas and things that we could be adding to it.
Great. Thank you. Tat, I would like to take up one comment in the chat from David Bakker. He said, your Mentimeter only allows for very brief answers, which is true. I would add a category that I would label the expectation of outcomes. This would answer, how will I move on with my life after my conflict is resolved? Is there something, I thought that was really interesting. So what do people need culturally in order to find closing in the mediation. Is that something you can comment on from your experience and maybe also cultural background? What does sort of a closing need within your context?
I like that actually, because it's not something that strikes one as a very obvious category of a cultural focus area. And what strikes me is that when you think of expectation of outcome, I think about the cases that I'm involved in this part of the world. And sometimes people think, they lump Asia together and say, well, they're Asian values, and, they seem to sort of immerse themselves in this smorgasbord of what might be Asian values. But I've come to discover in the work that I do that when you look at expectation of outcome, say, for a Chinese who lives in say, mainland China, and a company that he runs or she runs, what's their expectation of outcome in a conflict? They don't have, I think, in my experience, the same frame as someone coming from, say, Europe or the US, or even from Australia, or maybe in that sense, even from Singapore or Hong Kong. Because fundamentally, I think when you look at conflict and how it appears to a Chinese person who is looking at it from the frame of someone living in mainland China, a conflict is an opportunity perhaps to recalibrate and find out where the differences lie, so that you can reframe your relationship. If it's in the form of a contract, then we relook at the contract to see how we can put things better as we move along. And sometimes this is a widely misunderstood sort of concept, because when the Westerners, when we call it that, look at a Chinese company that hasn't fulfilled their end of the bargain that's been crystallized in the contract, they go into a dispute forum and say, breach, compensation, this is what we want as an outcome. Whereas when the Chinese people start, they're really thinking about, well, clearly there's a divergence. How can we gain some degree of convergence again? And until we understand that there's a divergence in what the expectations are in outcomes of conflict, it becomes very difficult for someone to step into the center and try and facilitate a conversation to resolve that conflict. So that's one that strikes me as being very obvious once you get into this space.
If I could add to that, Hannah, I think, what I hear Tat talking about is a sense of harmony as outcome. People are looking at a sense that we have a harmonious end and a relationship where we can turn the page and move on. But, in other countries, if I just look within Europe right now, we had a bit of a discussion about this, the very different approaches. So if you think about getting to yes, the American textbook that everybody has used, an outcome might look like a deal. What is a settlement? And some people might say if the mediation didn't settle, it wasn't a good mediation. Others, though, in Germany or in the Netherlands might say, no, you should never have an expectation of an outcome. It's all about the quality of the dialogue and how you rebuild a relationship between people. So a good mediation is one where people just were able to speak to one another and listen to one another, and whether or not they did a deal is unimportant, because it's the quality of the dialogue that matters. And so this is where we start to see culture even coming into trainings, into the very conceptualization of what mediation is, what makes a good mediation. And so this very question about what is the outcome that we are expecting in itself is a wonderful way to look into the cultural expectations so people can express it. But the words sometimes are not clear. And that's where, as mediators, I think we need to be able to help them to realize that while they're all saying we want this to settle, by settlement, they might mean very different words. And so that's where I think it can be helpful to prize that a bit as well.
Thank you so much. I think there are so many more words we could comment on. I saw many I would love to discuss further, but I'm being mindful of time. And one of the things we wanted to still do in the session is to share a bit of our experience, how the CFAs can be useful in our mediation practice. And so, Tat, I would like to hand it over to you again to share with us a real-life example of where you found this cultural framework useful in your preparation or in the mediation itself.
Well, let me springboard by just commenting on two cases, for example, and I'll just draw reference to the one that I mentioned earlier, that when I was mediating a case involving a US company and a Chinese company, the frame of mind, their mindset towards conflict was so different in the beginning. to the point that when the US attorneys were looking at how do I nail the Chinese company, and they resorted to recording a conversation between the two CEs, the two executives. And in that conversation, the US company executive said, I got you, because in that conversation, you said that you will fix all the defects that I brought to your knowledge, right? And so the context is an admission at law, and therefore, there's nothing left to say except, you compensate me. But then when you turn the mic over to the Chinese company, they said, but we have always been looking at this as a long-term relationship. And if you bring up something, naturally, my first response is, we want to help. We want to resolve your problem. And openly, we would say, how can we help? And so it speaks about mindsets that are very different. The other thing that I want to sort of say, which is helpful insofar as the CFAs are concerned, is communication styles. And communication style, I feel, is not just limited to what people say, their tonality, their physiology, but sometimes habits, and it strikes me that when I was doing some of my work in the communities in remote villages of, say, Indonesia, or Myanmar, or Cambodia, Vietnam, that sometimes the communication needs to be, how do you say, lubricated by food. Maybe as a Singaporean, I keep coming back to the theme of food, right? But it is the case, for example, recalling an incident in a village in Indonesia, that in the late hour of the evening, we were talking to a villager, and they came back from the river, bringing a fresh fish and cooking rice and some vegetables which they made. In that moment, my Singaporean instinct is, I don't actually eat at this time of the day. I would usually respectfully decline. But my host, who is also an interpreter, said, no, you have to eat this, because it is a demonstration of their rapport and their trust, and their acknowledgement that you're someone who can help them. So that taught me quite a lot of things that I was so ignorant about. And over time, I've come to sort of look at habits and culture and traditions as sometimes being even more important than what people say. So I think those are things which I've learned, among many other things, but they do strike an accord with me in the work that I do. Hannah.
Thanks so much, Tat. Great examples. Jeremy, maybe straight over to you.
Yeah, I have 3 examples I can think of. One of them is just don't be surprised by linguistic language interpretation issues. When people are coming to mediation from 2 different countries, you can't assume that everybody's got it sorted out. In one of the early days, I had an ADR institution that simply told me, show up on this date at this place, you're mediating between an American company and a French company, but the mediation was in Paris. So I show up in the room, and obviously there's a team of like 20 Americans who are there with lots of lawyers in business suits. And in the other room, I have around 6 people, all kind of French entrepreneurs who had driven up from the south of France together and had just a very different cultural approach. But the problem was already linguistic. The Americans came expecting that because they were coming from California, everything would be happening in English. And the French were coming thinking, okay, we're coming from the south of France to Paris, we're going to have a mediation in French. And neither side had brought an interpreter, neither side wanted an interpreter, and both sides felt that it should be in their language and not in the other language, which makes it very difficult for a mediator to show up in a room and all of a sudden you have to choose as your first act of mediation, which language do you greet people in? If you greet them in French, they'll be unhappy. If you greet them in English, they'll be unhappy. And so you've got to find either a third language to do it in, or you kind of have to do what I did at the time. I mixed every second word between English and French, saying to them, I can't keep this up. How are we going to handle this? But at least they were realizing I was trying to deal with a language issue. So that's one example of where you need to really be very careful up front in the preparation stage. In another case, I had a Russian and a French, 2 software companies at a dispute. And it was interesting because the Russian counsel in the case had chosen me because I was a CEDAR trained and a US trained mediator. So they're expecting me to do a lot of work in caucus. and to do all the work kind of, doing shuttle Kissinger-style diplomacy, moving back and forth between rooms. And yet, on the French side, I was a CMAP-trained mediator, which meant that I use a process called La Roue de Futac. It's a 4-step process the French teach for their mediation programs. And it didn't matter, but, they kind of were expecting me to work more in joint session. And so the moment, and became almost to blows, the lawyers were shouting at one another after the opening presentations that we had to go straight to caucus, and the other one was saying, no, we have to stay in joint session. And obviously, as the mediator, you need to be controlling that, you need to handle that, but they had very different cultural expectations about what my role would be, because one of them had chosen me because I was Cedar or, Jams, and the other one had chosen me because I was CMAP or Swiss. And so, again, you've got to really think about these things and make sure that that's why I find intake interviews are very, very helpful. Maybe on a third mediation and the topic of food that Tat touched upon, if you do have food, it's incredibly helpful, but it's got to be food that everybody can share and eat together. The very worst is when food is being shared and for religious or whatever other reasons, it cannot be shared, because that can dangerously augment a sense of out-of-groupness between the people. And so this became to me in a situation. So recently, Tad, I did a mediation at the Shangri-La Hotel in Singapore, simply because I knew they had a huge round table with 40 people, and I knew the food, they would always be able to come up with something that would suit all the 40 people in the room with a huge turning table. So that was, choice of, if you're going to do a big meal, think wisely of the setup and the infrastructure. Shangri-La Hotel in Singapore being a great place for that. But I also had a case between an Italian company and an Indian company, and the Italian company was very proud and wanted to serve veal, which for an Indian person, they didn't even realize that veal is cow. And so while the Italians were doing an act of hospitality, it wasn't just vegetarian, this is veal on top of all things. And so it was really an inappropriate dish, which you've kind of even got to pay attention sometimes to the menu and the details of what people will be eating. These are just examples, and we could go on, but I think it's the kind of thing that we need to have antenna for, and we'll sometimes miss them. And the important thing is to catch it on time. And when it's brought to our attention, not to minimize it, but to realize there could be a lot of importance to it, and to really make sure we understand what the implications or the feelings associated with that are, because it's very often an emotional-based reaction that we'll get.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. I'll maybe just add 2 examples from my practice. So one about the category of communication styles was a family case, parents fighting about their children, quite highly escalated. And between the 3rd and the 4th session, I was the co-mediator, we received an email from the mother with a long list of topics and allegations. And she had actually been quite quiet in session 1, 2, and 3, and hadn't really spoken up a lot for herself. And when I received the email, to which the father was copied, I thought, oh dear, this is definitely not in line with German mediation training, and what do we do now? And oh my God. And when I got to the session, I realized that was actually the best way she had chosen on how she was able to bring her topics and her needs to the table, because she wasn't the person who was going to proactively communicate about it. I think there were different matters of certainly personality, but I think also culture with regard on how proactively do you communicate about conflict and difficult topics. And the written form was one which she had chosen, which was able to save her face, and to actually bring up what was important to her. And it really changed the dynamic of the whole case. And I think I've learned a lot about direct and indirect communication. Second case, from my experience, having worked at the ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce in Paris for many years, where I was tasked with nominating mediators, so not being the mediator myself. Very high cross-border commercial case between a US company and a Spanish company. And we thought we were really clever that we appointed a UK mediator, one of the best in the UK, because we thought it's a European and speaks English, and the common language was English. And the mediation took place in Spain. And I got a call very quickly that the whole process had failed, and the Spanish party was really unhappy with the process. And I had a feedback conversation with them and asked, but sort of what happened? You know, we chose one of the best UK mediators, and they said, well, he wanted to immediately start discussing the conflict. We didn't even have time to have lunch together. So I think a completely different understanding of what it means to build trust in relationship, what you need in order to trust even the mediator to go into this process. And also with regard to the timing of the case, I'm sure the UK mediator felt really efficient and sort of thought that this was his responsibility on how to run the process, in a very different sense around the timing and the importance of relationship building from the other side. Okay, so these were some examples from us. We would love to open the floor now to any other comments or questions. And if there are some already in the chat in Ukrainian, maybe somebody can help me and translate them. Otherwise, again, the invitation to please just raise your Zoom hand, and then we'll be happy to open your microphone. We have one from Victoria in the chat. I'll just read it. Are you aware of any cases where intercultural ethics were violated during mediation, where the situations involving clashes of cultural values or stereotypes, and how did IMI standards function in such cases? I'd appreciate any examples and your perspective on the response mechanisms. Tat or Jeremy, who would like to take this question? And then we'll have a question from Siddhartha.
So I have one, Tat, unless you have one you want to share. I should go. So I'm not sure to what extent it was intercultural, but it was definitely an important ethical dispute. This was a mediation in the United States where there was a person dying, and the person had been a concentration camp survivor. And she'd been at Buchenwald, she'd survived, but many years later on, she found herself in her 80s, and she's dying in a hospital, and the doctors in America are suggesting kind of aggressive life support. You should intubate, you should put technology in place so that she will be fed artificially, breathing artificially, or she's going to die. And then you have two children who've been brought up in different places with different cultural kind of norms. One of them is saying this is her life. She's a Holocaust survivor. She fought her entire life to survive. And the other one is saying, no, this is about dignity, self-dignity, and quality of life. This is not the way she would want to end. And so this led to actually a huge fight between the children in that case, because they just had different views. They obviously loved their mother. They were trying to be respectful of their mother's values and their perception of what their needs might be. But they were so kind of into a positional logic that it kind of almost took them a step back into the ethics of why they cared so much. At the end of the day, actually, they ended up resolving it by going to their mother and kind of finding a way to ask her. She was very conscious, she was very intelligent, she knew what the situation was. And when they kind of explained the choices that she had and the reasons why they were having a different opinion, and she said, you know, which one, she kind of shrugged. She couldn't say herself. And so that tension within the children was a tension that she was feeling herself. And so, you know, at the end of the day, they found a solution, which obviously did not involve extending her life beyond what was medically possible, but they found a very meaningful way to deal with it that included what she wanted, the whole family, and it was a very moving thing that I still has touched me very much to be able to be involved in that mediation, which is not what I normally do as a mediator. But I think that was an example of where ethical issues come in, and you've just got to adapt and be flexible and help people get to why do they take these positions, and what does an ethical behavior mean. There's normally something if you can go deep enough behind it, you'll understand that it's about a quality of life and a quality of death. That was the issue, and how to make it as optimal as possible given the horrible circumstances.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Before coming to the Siddhartha's question, I would like to just point to the conversation in the chat about how one can actually show that one has these qualifications. As Ivana has explained in the chat, IMI doesn't do training or qualifications itself. It rather certifies other organizations who provide this training. At the moment, there's only one training provider for the specific intercultural competencies, But what we would love to see is many more providers worldwide, including in Ukraine and all the other many countries you are joining us from, to take up these criteria and provide training on their basis and qualifications. So this is also one of the reasons why we are highlighting this here again, because we believe that these competencies need to be spread more and that many more mediators need to be trained in them and certified in them. And with them, Siddhartha, you will be our final question for the session. So over to you. Could somebody unmute Siddhartha? Actually, Siddhartha just, sorry, I always added an A. Could somebody from the org? Yeah, now.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, panelists, for your insightful session and especially adding so many comments on various experiences and various, enriching suggestions. I was really, touched by the way everyone has kind of presented their view. I just have a very simple question, being an aspiring law student, that, when you have multiple nationalities on a table and you are having this mediation going on, what are some of the thematic concerns that usually arise? Like you said that, on food, on language, on culture, on ethnicity, there are lots of concerns that you need to keep in mind while addressing disputes and while addressing these mediation meetings. But what would you think that, as an amateur mediator or like probably a first-time mediator, what suggestions would you actually have for someone going into law and addressing this side of the debate? Thank you.
Jeremy, you're smiling. Would you like to respond?
Well, I have a very easy, facile response, which actually goes a bit deeper, but I would apply, I don't know if you know the ACBD rule. It's not that I have a problem spelling the letters of the alphabet in correct order. It's always consult before deciding, ACBD. And I think exactly in these sorts of situations, it's essential to really take time up front to speak to each of the parties, to go over all of these questions that you've raised, Siddharth, and then to really be able to help get us kind of a framework of what you think will work for everybody. But I think one of the big dangers is when a mediator comes in and says, you've selected me, this is how I do my mediations, and therefore I'm just going to go ahead. Especially, I think, when you're working internationally, that's a dangerous assumption. And I think it's really important to take the time in advance to always consult before deciding, ACBD.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. And with that, I'm afraid we will be coming to the end of this session. I think a good discussion is never the one where one has all the answers in the end, but where lots of open questions remain, because that will mean we will continue having conversations about it. And that is what we should have, because intercultural competency is maybe more important than ever before, especially for mediators and peacemakers. Ivana already put a link into the chat from IMI, where IMI invites further comments on the intercultural competencies, and we would very much love to hear your further thoughts and feedback. You will find that link also in the materials, which we will share with you. On behalf of Jeremy, Tat, and Ivana, I would like to very much thank the organizers for the impeccable and super professional organization of this wonderful event. It was an absolute honor to be invited and to be able to speak on this first panel. I would love to thank everybody who joined us here today. How wonderful to see the whole world represented. That is the magic of online events. And at the same time, I would like to probably share the hope of many that one time in the not too distant future, we can all meet in Ukraine for one of the next editions of the forum. So I'm wishing you a wonderful forum. Stay safe, be well. And if you want to get in touch with any of us, you can find us on LinkedIn or get our contact details via the organizers. And we wish you a wonderful day and a very good forum. Thank you very much.
Я хочу подякувати, колеги, кожному з вас, Анна,
Dear
Джеремі.
colleagues, I'd like to thank Tat, Jeremy, Anna. Thank you for inspiring us. It was a relatively short session, but you inspired us so much. We've covered so much. We focused on important skills to be very effective in intercultural environment. Thank you for sharing your standards, experiences to improve the quality of mediation. Because this is especially important for young mediators, those who don't have much experience. So thank you very much. Today, we will have a further interesting session dedicated to interpretation in mediation. Sometimes it's hard to find the right word, and it's hard to select the right word to keep emotions under control so that you can actually communicate effectively. I would also like to thank our interpreters. I saw words of appreciation in the chat. We thank Alexander and Oleg because thanks to you, we were able to understand each other quite well.